supposed to have rain today, but maybe there's some rain on the way.
Yes.
Yeah. Everything okay, honey? Yeah. Okay. So today we are looking at Daniel chapter 5. And I just want to give you a little highlight over chapter 5. There was a mystery over Belshazzar. For many years, the scientists and the archaeologists in the past, they have said Belshazzar doesn't exist. His name is only found in the scriptures, but not in history. Now in 1854, there was a Sir Henry Rawlinson. He deciphered the name Belshazzar on a clay cylinder unearthed from the ruins of ancient Ur in Iraq. The inscription was a prayer of Nabonidus to his god Bel for himself and his son Belshazzar. Now, in the Bible you find references to Belshazzar regarding Nebuchadnezzar, your father. It's his grandfather, but because he was an ancestor, it is often referred to as a father. Like we read in chapter 5, they brought the Queen Mother. She is likely to have been a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and therefore the mother of Belshazzar. So Belshazzar was 2 generations down, and after Nebuchadnezzar came Nabonidus. Nabonidus didn't want to have the burden of the kingdom upon his shoulders. So after just a few years, he moved somewhere else to Timah in Arabia. He moved there to have a retirement, an early retirement, and he left Belshazzar in charge of the kingdom. But Belshazzar was not a hard-working man. Belshazzar was fond of luxury and self-indulgence, and that helped him to lead the country down into ruin. But we will find out in this chapter how it was happening. Now the Babylonian kingdom was becoming weaker. Under Nebuchadnezzar it was very strong, and nobody really dared to attack Babylon. But Nebuchadnezzar, after his cure from insanity, we read last week, he wrote a chapter in the Bible and said, I want everyone to know that I now worship the King of Heaven. All his works are just, and those who are proud he is able to bring down. Now he learned the lesson, and we like to think that when we go to heaven, we will see Nebuchadnezzar there. He was converted.
That's right.
But the conversion didn't go to all his followers, the descendants that came from him. So Belshazzar was aware of it, aware of what happened to his grandfather, but probably being 2 generations younger, he thought, oh, that happened to my old grandfather, it wouldn't happen to me. So the kingdom became weaker, and there were, as always happens, there were the prying eyes of another nation watching what is happening in Babylon. There are countries, so I read on the news, countries that are watching what is happening with Russia and the Ukraine. And they say if Russia weakens, they will also have a revolt against Russia. So it's just a beginning, but they are watching. They're watching what is happening. Is this the right time in history to take a stand? And so here it says, Belshazzar, he knew the Medes and the Persians were on their march to Babylon. but he believed the capital was so strong that nobody could get in. And so, what did he do? He organized a huge party of drunkenness and revelry just on the last night of his reign. He didn't know it was the last night, but we will find out from chapter 5 how it all came to an end. And I'm now asking Luke, would you please read chapter 5 for us?
Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels they had taken from the temple of the house of God which had been in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. Verse 5. In that same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked against each other. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple, and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing, or make known to the king its interpretation. The king Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. Verse 10. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation." Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you." Verse 15. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you, that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple, and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty, glory and honour. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished he executed, whomever he wished he kept alive, whomever he wished he set up, and whomever he wished he put down." Verse 20. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men, his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son Belteshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this, and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hands and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. Verse 25. And this is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of each word, Mene. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night Belshazzar, king of Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old.
Thank you, Luke. What is swift judgment? You know, when we indulge ourselves, we lose a sense of reality. Belshazzar had the privilege that he knew his grandfather and his father. He knew the history. As Daniel said, you knew all this, and yet you didn't humble yourself. You thought, oh, young people, they can do things differently. Well, friends, let's go through the chapter one question at a time. First question, a nation on the brink, feeling safe and secure behind the city walls, what did Belshazzar command to be brought to the banqueting hall? Did you get it when it was read? Yeah. You know, friends, it is alright for yourself to reject teachings of religion. It is alright. God has given us a free will and a free choice. If we want to do it one way, we are free to do it that way. If we want to do it a different way, we are free. God has given us the freedom. But there is such a thing as a limit to how far God will let us go away from his will. Now, when Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels, which had been many years now in the temple of the Babylonian god, he ordered that they would be brought into the banqueting hall so that they could defile them, that they could fill them with alcoholic beverages and praise their gods and not praise the God of heaven. He went over a line where God said, you're not allowed to go over it. You know, in other words, he desecrated the vessels from the house of God, and God said to Solomon, in this house I will put my presence. I will be happy to be there and honor the world and Jerusalem and you through my presence. And yet these sacred vessels, Belshazzar ordered, bring them in. I mean, they wouldn't have been short on vessels. It was just an open rebellion against the God of heaven. And so God said, I'm not going to let you go that way. Okay. In the temple, in the house of Daniel's God, we know there were several pieces of furniture. When you went in, on the left-hand side, there was the 7-branched lampstand. You see it here. On the right hand, there was a table of showbread, and it was replaced every week for new bread. Only the priests were allowed to eat it. And there were vessels. You see here some jugs. Sorry, there's one further. Here, a jug here, some cups here. There were a few vessels, but there were more vessels. Hundreds of vessels in the temple for the use of the temple. And these Nebuchadnezzar, because many of them were gold or silver, he carried them off when he finally destroyed the temple. And so they ended up in the temple of Bel, or Marduk is another name for it. And here's another picture of the vessels that would have been used. And now Belshazzar is saying, oh, I might as well use them for my party. You know, when you don't believe or you don't agree with a certain religion, don't drag it in the mud. Because you don't know, I don't know, what is really happening behind the scenes. The Bible teaches us that the true God only gave us one religion, and that is the religion of the Hebrews, which we would call later on the Jewish religion. And out of the Jewish religion, when Jesus came as a Jew, when he came, he gave us Christianity. So we have the Christian religion, which is rooted in Scripture. But the other religions, they don't have God behind them, but there is still a very powerful force behind it, and that is, there are many demons that have encouraged people to start religions. And you don't want to take on the demons if you don't have to. Let them do what they want to do. You keep yourself busy with serving your God. Okay, so Belshazzar had desecrated the vessels from the temple that had been dedicated to the service of God. And here in question 2, what frightening event interrupted the celebrations? You know, imagine there is 1,000 people in the hall. They are all drunk to one extent or another. They are dancing and praising and reveling in the banqueting hall. They are taking the wine that the king provided in the sacred vessels and poured it down their throats. And all of a sudden, there is a quiet time. All of a sudden, the king saw a man's hand, the finger of a man's hand. He didn't see the person, but he saw the hand. And the hand was writing on the wall. You know, we have a saying that we use sometimes. The writing is on the wall. That's right. When we or somebody else has gone further than we thought they should go, and we think they're coming unstuck, we say, the writing is on the wall. That saying, where do you think it came from? 2,500 years ago, from the old Babylonian Empire. The writing is on the wall. And so he saw the writing. Was he happy about it?
No. Well, unless he understood it.
He was shocked. So shocked that it describes him as his knees are knocking together. He can't stand still. All his joints are loosened and he is in a real state of panic. And so he calls out, the wise men, the astrologers, quickly come in here. So they come in and he says, if you can tell us, if you can tell us the writing on the wall and the interpretation, I will make it worth your while. Now, why would he have said, and I'll make you the third ruler in the kingdom and not the second ruler? You know, usually you read when the king in ancient times, when he offered something, it was usually, I make you the second in command of the kingdom. But Belshazzar said, I'll make you the third ruler. There was a second ruler. It was Nabonidus. When he stepped aside, he was still the second ruler of Nebuchadnezzar, his father's kingdom of Babylon. He was in retirement, but he still had the title and the name. And so he couldn't say, I'll make you the second ruler. His dad was the second ruler. His dad, by choice, made Belshazzar the first ruler. And therefore he only offered the third ruler. But the third ruler is still a big post, especially for Babylon. So we said the finger of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. Now when Luke read to us, what facts could you find in verses 4 to 9 which show that the message on the wall could not have been written by a human being? Did you find some hints to say, oh, this must have been a spirit being because it wasn't a human being? You know, we have some answers here. While they were praising and carrying on, suddenly it appeared. And it was higher up on the plaster. They didn't say, oh, somebody came with a ladder and did some graffiti on the wall. No. It appeared, and the finger were not attached to a body. They were attached to a hand, but then they couldn't see what else it was attached to. So we know it was God, and the other thing that tells us it was God is because Daniel understood what it said, and Daniel was God's servant. If it was a demon, he might have used a different language, but what was written here, Daniel could interpret it, and he could read it. So we go to just an artist's impression about the revelry that went on in Babylon. And there is an artist's impression of the finger of a man's hand. So, now the king is in such a state, as I said, he doesn't know what to do. The lords that were there, it said, they were astonished when they saw their king. What's happened to Belshazzar? And this word went through the palace very quickly, and his mother, which I said, it is believed to be Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, came into the banqueting hall. Now when you hear what she said and what her advice was, you see that she knew Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar's history. She knew it quite well. So what wise suggestion did she make to the king? There's a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God. They were familiar with the term God. They would worship Bel and Marduk as if they were existing. But this is different. There is a man that is different. He is possessed, we might say, by a much different spirit than all our astrologers. And you know, up to now, it has been 3 times that the astrologers and soothsayers have been called in to the king to interpret something that God has shown, and they could not. When in the beginning the king could not remember the dream, they could not give the dream, they could not interpret it. Later on, the king gave the dream, but they still could not interpret it. Belshazzar can show them, can you read this writing and interpret it? And they could not. The wise men were frogs. They believed and they pretended to know something which they didn't know. Now friends, today people go to other people who don't know. They're not called soothsayers and those from Babylonian times, but they're called clairvoyants. You know, they pretend they know your future, and as long as you pay them something, they'll tell you what they think is in your future. They just dream up, because God doesn't work through clairvoyance. Okay, we go on. What did the queen say this man had been able to do for Nebuchadnezzar? Answering in your own words, he was able to interpret dreams and to solve puzzles or explain enigmas, things that were so puzzling that nobody knew the answer. That is why they asked Daniel, what was the interpretation? Ready to move on? What was the man's name? We come across him all through the chapters. It was Daniel, whom Nebuchadnezzar called Belteshazzar. Daniel again. Now, when you do a bit of work with the numbers, Babylon lasted for 70 years. A few years had passed before the Judeans were taken into exile. But this is on the night when Babylon is falling. So the 70 years of Babylon are up on that day. And so you go back, Daniel was about 18 years of age when he was taken to Babylon. He would be in his late 80s now. In the next question, when Daniel was brought before the king, what did Belshazzar promise to give him if he could interpret the writing on the wall? Now we remember what Luke read. He said, you shall be clothed with purple. Purple was the color of the kings. Yes, purple and gold. You shall have a chain of gold around your neck, and you shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, Daniel is in his retirement. Belshazzar didn't have much time for Daniel. This was the history. He was in a new era. He wasn't interested in what God or God's prophet had to say. He lived his own life, and so it seems that Daniel was not in the office of one of the wise men or the leader of the wise men, but he was in retirement. At 88, you would expect that. They usually only lived up to around 60 or 70. So Daniel was at a ripe old age. What would it help him to become the third ruler in the kingdom? However, Belshazzar kept his promise. While he was drunken and made many foolish decisions, he had made the promise and he carried it out. So now imagine Daniel is dressed like royalty. That means if the enemy comes in and looks for royalty, it can affect Daniel's life too. And we see that God had an answer for it. Now, was Daniel interested in making money or receiving honors out of his work as a prophet? What reply did he make to the king? I notice in the years that I am in now, making money is not important. No, I'm retired. What is the money going to do? I mean, I can find good things to do with it, but to run after money is just not as attractive. When you're young, you have children, and you have big responsibilities, you need money. But when you retire, it doesn't matter. Here in this country, the government looks after us that we are not begging. So I thought, Daniel, it wouldn't be attractive to him. I mean, when you're, say, 88, what does it matter whether people bow down to you and say, oh, long live the third ruler? It doesn't matter. You don't know how much longer you have because you are already in the years that are by God's grace. You passed the 70 years and you're in your late retirement. So Daniel said, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. You know, Daniel is a very level-headed man. He doesn't mix his words. He is saying things as he feels inspired to say it. And it's a very clear message. Belshazzar doesn't have to guess what Daniel means. Now Daniel, we notice, was not in a hurry to explain the writing on the wall. He wanted to remind Belshazzar of what happened to his grandfather. So he is saying here, first he wanted to remind Belshazzar about his failure to learn from God's dealings with Nebuchadnezzar. We read in verses 18 to 21 what he said, and Daniel's message to the king, and any lessons we should learn from it were in those verses. He said, your grandfather lifted himself up. God had blessed him and given him a wonderful kingdom and authority and honor. But when he was lifted up, God brought him down. Put him back where he could learn from the beginning. And sometimes God has to take drastic measures to bring us to our senses. And he says, and when your grandfather learned that God rules in the kingdoms of men, and he gives it to whomever he pleases, then Nebuchadnezzar was healed, and God returned to him the throne and great honor until he died. And it appears that he would have died within 1 or 2 years after this experience. Then came Nabonidus, just for about 3 years, and then he handed it on to his son Belshazzar. So Daniel says to him, you should have learned from how God dealt with Nebuchadnezzar, with his experience, and you should not have been proud. To defile the vessels of God shows pride. You think nothing is going to happen to you, God can't reach you. The king should have learned from Nebuchadnezzar's experience and should not have been proud. You know, we learn from Scripture that somebody in God's everlasting kingdom in a very high position, Lucifer, was proud, and God brought him down. He is not proud now. He pretends to us, but he is not proud. He has nothing to be proud about. Question 8. What did Daniel say was the reason for the writing on the wall? He said, "But you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, your heart, although you knew all this." So imagine, if there are only no more than 10 years between the experience of Nebuchadnezzar and this experience of Belshazzar, then you would think surely Belshazzar would have known. And he did know, according to what Daniel said. "And you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven." You have done the unthinkable thing and thought that you, as a mortal human being, you can outsmart God. What a fool Belshazzar turned out to be. So that is why God sent, so says Daniel, why God sent this hand to write on the plaster of the wall, and then he comes to the description. What 3 things had Belshazzar done that were most offensive to God? Well, he said, you desecrated or you defiled the sacred vessels that were for the worship of the true God. You have worshipped false gods and filled the vessels with fermented wine, and then you lifted them to praise demons, but you would not praise the God of heaven. You know, how much lower can people go? God thought that was it. It was the lowest point for Belshazzar just before his life was ended. Who did Daniel say was responsible for the writing on the wall? He said it was the God of heaven. He sent the hand. The doom is pronounced upon Babylon. Question 11. From these verses that Luke read, read the 4 mysterious words and write the interpretation which Daniel gave. He said, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, or Perez, depending whether you have one language or another. Now the answer is Mene, and it is repeated. It says, Babylonian kingdom is ended. With other words, God said, you have been weighed in the balances, and you found wanting. Then in Tekel, God is saying, you have been judged. You have been found guilty. Friends, what a solemn warning for us today, isn't it? That God takes note of everything that happens on the earth. And he says he has books where good things and bad things are all recorded. And when he makes a judgment on you and me, it will be a righteous judgment, but the outcome may be different from what we expect. It is very solemn. God loves us with an everlasting love, but he is a God of justice. And if we deserve punishment, it will come. Perez or Upharsin says, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. This was the coalition that was waiting outside the borders of Babylon, and they were preparing to make an attack on Babylon to try and take away the kingdom from Babylon and become the kingdom of the Medes and Persians. Question 12. What was meant by Belshazzar being weighed in the balances and found wanting? What do you think this term or this comparison means? When you're weighed in the balances, we have a saying, you don't measure up. What does that mean?
Not living in accordance with God's measures.
Yes, we are aware of a standard when you go for a job interview and you stammer and stutter. They might say, thank you for your time, but no thank you, or you don't quite fit the mark that we expect. It's the same as saying, you have been weighed, we have interviewed you, but you have come out wanting. There was things that were missing. This is what God says to Belshazzar. He would have said the same to Nebuchadnezzar in his early years, but through God's leading, he had accepted that God rules over all. He is in charge. We are only put there by him. But Belshazzar couldn't care less about God. And so he was coming up short. He didn't fill the measure that was expected of him. How long did it take for judgment that had been pronounced that evening to come upon Belshazzar? You've got 4 options. 24 hours, a month, a year, 10 years. What did you circle? 24 hours. The judgment was swift. It was final. There was no arbitration. Oh, let's go to court and see. No mediation, no. He didn't measure up. God had put him in a responsible position, and he didn't measure up. He thought it was all just for his own enjoyment. So what happened? How could Darius, the Mede, how could he come and conquer Babylon during that night? The river Euphrates went through, as you can see here, through the city of Babylon. They had iron gates, strong iron gates, double gates, on the outside of the wall and on the inside of the wall, down to the riverbed, or very close to the riverbed. Cyrus, who was also a general, and they worked together, they ordered their soldiers, while they were reveling in the inside, they said, dig ditches away from the river, and at a given command, break the last little bit which holds the water in the river. And so they made ditches on both sides of the river, and the water suddenly went sideways, and the water level dropped. And so the soldiers were so confident that Cyrus or Darius could come and they wouldn't be able to get into Babylon, that they left the inside gates unlocked. The outside gates were locked. You thought everything was locked up as before, but the inside gates were open or unlocked. And so when the water level dropped, the soldiers were able to get in low on the Euphrates riverbed. And they came to the second gates, and they could just march through. And of course on the inside, they are all drunk. So that same night, Belshazzar was slain. We will find out that the outcome for Daniel was very different, and that in itself was miraculous through God's leading. So who received the kingdom after the death of Belshazzar, which was that night? What did it say in the last verse of chapter 5? Darius the Mede. As I said, Medo-Persia was a coalition. Cyrus the Great, he was the real leader of the war, of this attack. But because it was a coalition, when they had secured Babylon for themselves, Cyrus was very kind in saying, Darius, you sort out the kingdom, I'll put you in charge of Babylon. Now Cyrus might have been a little bit younger than Darius. Darius, how old was Darius?
60.
Yes, 62 years. And Ben, 62 years, is this an old man? Yeah, 62 years. Especially in those days, Daniel was one of the very few that lived to a ripe old age. Daniel. Darius was a good organizer, as we will learn next week, and he organized the kingdom, and we will carry on with chapter 6 next week. But now Babylon is finished, and Daniel witnesses how prophecy has been fulfilled, that Babylon would be conquered by Medo-Persia. So again, there's Daniel just thinking and talking about what the meaning of this inscription was. Now, our lesson finishes here. That's the end of chapter 5. And we just have 5 true or false questions. So if you take the little sticky pad, and please write your name on it. And then you can put in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, T, F, T, F, or however you decide. But please don't forget to put your name on it. First question is, Belshazzar held a drunken orgy in which he openly challenged God by drinking from the sacred vessels of God's sanctuary. Is this true or false? Just T or F. T or F. Question 2. A supernatural hand wrote on Belshazzar's palace wall to announce the end of the Babylonian kingdom. Is that question true or false? T or N? Question 3. It took less than 24 hours for the prophecy of Belshazzar's death to be fulfilled. Is that question true or false? Question 4. The kingdom of Babylon fell to the Medes and the Persians. True or false? T or F? And question 5, or true or false, yes. Question 5. Daniel was not able to make clear to Belshazzar exactly why the kingdom was being taken from him. Is that true or false? Okay, you're all finished?
Yeah.
Good. We'll go back to question 1. Belshazzar held a drunken orgy in which he openly challenged God by drinking from the sacred vessels of God's sanctuary. What was it, T or F? T for true. Yeah. Question 2. A supernatural hand wrote on Belshazzar's palace wall to announce the end of the Babylonian kingdom. True or false? True. Question 3. It took less than 24 hours for the prophecy of Belshazzar's death to be fulfilled. True. Question 4. The kingdom of Babylon fell to the Medes and Persians. True. Yes, and Darius was the first ruler. Question 5. Daniel was not able to make clear to Belshazzar exactly why the kingdom was being taken from him. Is that true or false? False. Daniel made it very clear. Now friends, that brings us to the end of the lesson, the writing on the wall. You have the new lesson on your table. It is the night in the lion's den. We have a lesson on Daniel in the lion's den. So we invite you to do that lesson and come back next week and we will go through that. We are then ending all the story part. The first half of the book of Daniel will be ended next week, and then we carry on with the prophetic part. And just a reminder, the lessons we learn in the first half will help us to understand what Daniel is saying to God's children that live at the end of time. And so, I thank you for coming this evening. Please remember there is refreshment waiting for you at the end. Please leave your seat pad there and let us bow our heads for a closing prayer. Our loving Father in heaven, thank you so much for sharing with us that what you say, you mean. That we as mortal human beings are not free to talk respectless against the God of heaven. Dear Lord, may we learn good and valuable lessons from this story. And dear Lord, please grant us a good week, and may we be able to come together again next Sunday. We ask in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Thank you very much, and God bless.